Hello, I'm Ian Sharp. This is my presentation for the British Academy of Photography on Unit 4 Contextual Studies, Assignment 8 Research Presentation. All references that I've used both on the slides and in my spoken words can be found in the appendix at the end. During Assignment 8, I've researched a topic to be used in an article for the museum website and subsequently a temporary exhibition. This builds on the research I did during Assignment 7, and I started to wonder about the relationship between photography and culture and society as a whole, and indeed the authenticity of some of the images that I was studying. I was reminded of the novel The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, where Machiavelli describes how a strong ruler may sometimes have to commit immoral acts in order to provide security and stability for his country. This approach is sometimes described as the end justifies the means. So my topic that I have been researching is, in creating photographic images, to what extent does the end justify the means? Before presenting my research, I'd like first to talk about what we mean by context in art and design. Riley describes context as all the things about the artwork that might have influenced it or the artist, but which are not actually part of the artwork itself. She goes on to explain then that contextual information can deepen and or improve our understanding of an artwork, and she breaks this down into three specific areas. Firstly, the historical context. So at what point in time was the artwork created? What was happening in society? What were the cultural norms at that point? Secondly, the artist context. What is about the artist, his or her culture, place and worldview that artist takes forward and presents in the art? And finally, the viewing context. How is the image to be viewed? If it's viewed, for example, in a gallery, it's a very different experience from looking at it on a 6-inch phone. To describe the topic a little further, I had a number of questions outstanding as I went into Assignment 8 relating to what extent does the end justify the means? These included, how relevant is the genre and intention of the photographer? To what extent, if any, is staging different from posing? And how does this differ, if at all, from catching the image at, to quote Henri Cartier-Bresson, the decisive moment? Does an image have the same value if staged? And does how the image will be viewed influence the approach? How has best practice changed over time due to shifting societal and cultural norms? And what role, if any, do captions play in providing context to images? And a big question in the current environment is what level of post-production is desirable, acceptable, or really not okay? And does that depend on the context? So specifically, what role does context play in each of these questions? The relevance and importance of context can be seen through the historical perspective. So as photographic movements developed and attitudes in society and culture changed, so did what the artists were trying to create, whether it was a documentary photograph or something more artistic, if there was a story or what's the style or an aesthetic that the photographer was trying to achieve. Likewise, along with the viewing context, who was going to be viewing the audience and what were their expectations? So if we look now at someone viewing on a 6-inch phone, their experience will be very different from someone viewing on a gallery. The first of my three secondary research areas considers documentary images, 3 of which are shown on the screen. The first, of Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange, was possibly posed, or maybe it was just the best of the 7 images she took at the time during her very brief 10-minute visit to the camp. The second image by Don McCullum was staged. So Don McCullum has been very clear, not in the caption, but in the text associated with the image, that he staged this image. He came across the soldier who'd recently been killed by US Marines who were talking disparagingly about him, and he wanted to tell the story of this soldier. So he laid out his possessions in quite a dramatic way, noting, the picture of his sister with the bullets framing her face. The third image from Robert Capa was believed to be genuine for many years, but more recently has been shown conclusively to be staged, perhaps around 25 miles away from where the actual fighting was taking place. However, in all 3 images, in the second and third images where there was an element of being staged or probably faked, the intent of the photographer was a good one, to raise awareness of what was happening in the world. So I'm wondering, to what extent does the artist's intent justify the means by which they created the image? And I argue that the image is demeaned by the fact that the images were faked or staged, and that takes something away from the meaning. Indeed, my conclusion is an accurate depiction of events, then the image must accurately present the scene as experienced. If it's been manipulated, then the end does not justify the means, whatever the intent. And indeed, for documentary photography, I think the World Press Photo Awards ethics guidelines, which state that they must not intend to mislead by recreating or staging events, and that if a reenactment has been taken, that is acceptable if and only if it's documented and is transparent about the motivation and process, and done so within the captions, which Don McCullum didn't do. And however much I love this image, unfortunately it'll never have the same impact on me knowing that it's been staged. The second of my secondary research areas covers propaganda photographs. The image Fig 4 on the left hand side shows a flag over the Reichstag that was doctored to remove looted items and indeed was restaged 2 weeks after the Reichstag had actually fallen to Soviet troops. The image on the right shows how Stalin's photographer had removed a general who had fallen from grace within the Soviet regime. The historical context of this was that it was a totalitarian regime, and the artist was trying to record the facts, in quotes, as required by the state, perhaps with an element of self-preservation. The viewers were expected to accept this as the official version of the truth, and my conclusion is that if the intention is for propaganda, then the end justifies the means only to the perpetrators, though never to an impartial observer. My final piece of secondary research considers the creation of a work of art. In this case, with these two images, actors were used and recreated a spontaneous event, or indeed was carefully constructed to give exceptionally strong composition. The context was to demonstrate how new freedoms and openness and expression of society could be shown to a public unused to such public shows of affection. And the artist Bresai, who took image 7 on the right hand side, wrote that the meaning of art is not authenticity but an expression of authenticity. I argue in this case that if the intention is to create a work of art, then posing, staging, combining images as the pictorialist did, and any amount of post-production work is justified, because the work is ultimately judged on artistic merit, not creative process. My first piece of primary research concerns a questionnaire to the well-known street photographer Brian Lloyd Duckett. Brian believes that as a candid pursuit, street photographers cannot get informed consent from subjects, and therefore an ethical approach is appropriate. It is important not to defame or ridicule subjects, although having a bit of a giggle, as figures 8 and 9 above show, is important. It is also important to recognise that it's not someone's status but how they're shown is important in this ethical approach. And figure 10, one of my photographs of a big issue vendor, highlights how someone in a not brilliant position in life can be taken in quite an appealing way to give an image which shows her in the best possible light. But Lloyd Duckett disagrees with Bresai and Drozno on the previous slide in believing that staging a photograph diminishes its value as a street photography image. Although if the intent is to get the aesthetic look, he's perhaps in agreement. But street photographers either need to seek out the story, the decisive moment, as Cartier-Bresson will say, or go for the aesthetic look, so something more artistic. So indeed, I'd conclude that in street photography, from the work with Brian I did, that ethical considerations are extremely important, and the end doesn't always justify the means. But that as street photography covers a wide spectrum for which the image must be authentic and similar to a documentary at the one side, and on the other side a lot of creative freedoms associated with a work of art, here therefore artistic content is absolutely key. I then visited a retrospective exhibition of Helen Levitt's work at the London Photographers Gallery. What you now notice straight away is how she's photographed children, with them either being easily identifiable in the older images, but in the more recent ones from 1980 onwards, it's very difficult to identify who that child is, which demonstrates a change in historical context. Unlike Lloyd Duckett, Levitt is very visible to her subjects, often courting them. She also chooses no captions for her images, leaving the entire interpretation to the viewer, which is really interesting. So what I've identified from this is that acceptable practice can change over time. Again, Lloyd Duckett contrasts with Levitt, contrasts with Drozno and Bresai, and that a gallery presentation with no captions can be most thought-provoking, whilst the curator's choice can lead the viewer through that exhibition. My final piece of research concerns post-production. Fig 13 shows an edit that's credible but not what was seen. For example, looking at the lower image, you see that a couple of people have been edited out and someone else moved in front of the waterfall. Fig 14 in the middle is an edit that I've just done, which shows or attempts to show what was actually seen on the day, much the same way as Ansel Adams would dodge and burn. And figure 15 is not a credible edit. It's what we call Instagram sunset. Here, the artist context is really important. What was the objective? Is it to create art, or is it to create an accurate record of what was seen on the day? And indeed, how will this image be viewed? If it's seen in a gallery, a book, or a 6-inch phone screen, and who is the target audience, that may well determine what is an appropriate edit. It's also possible, shown in figures 16 to 18, from a variety of photographers to edit into a particular style. So here we find Frankie editing in a very similar style to Saul Leiter, and I've just taken one of my photographs and edited in a very similar way to achieve a particular aesthetic. So my conclusion is that in editing photographs in post-production, it really does depend on the context. What is the artist's objective? Who is the audience, and how will the image be viewed? And then edit accordingly. My accompanying research journal has much deeper analysis and further conclusions. A summary of the conclusions, however, is shown here. Historical context is very important as best practice changes over time as society and cultures change. Artistic context is the one that stands out most through this analysis. So a documentary photographer who's intending an accurate depiction of the events will look for something very different from someone seeking to create a work of art, which requires a different approach, with the artistic merit judging the photograph rather than the creative process. I note that street and landscape photographers have sharply conflicting views on staging and editing respectively. The viewing context is key as well. So how will an image be viewed? Is it going to be curated in a gallery or a book or an Instagram via a 6-inch screen? This leads to very different possibilities, along with also captioning of images too. So in summary, I would say that evaluation of the statement, in creating photographic images, the end justifies the means, is entirely dependent on context and will make an excellent temporary exhibition for the museum. Thank you.